Hello, my name is Drandis. I'm the head of map aesthetics, and I am the terrain painter for CK3 AGOT. Today I'm going to be showing you our terrain teaser, giving you a sneak peek at Westeros as we envision it, and showing you a bit of what CK3 AGOT will look like in our upcoming beta. We're going to be taking a look at some beautiful scenery from throughout our map, as well as taking a look at some of the principles that guide our design process, the mechanics that those principles inform. We're going to be enjoying some beautiful music from our mod, and hopefully we can all get excited together about the not too distant future of CK3 AGOT. As a brief disclaimer, all of this is a work in progress. Although we do feel that the map is beautiful as is, we are also aware that there's much and more we can still do. So without further delay, let's leave the haunted forest here and head south to Dorne. Over the last 2 months, we've begun a massive rework of our map. This involves not just retooling, retexturing, but frankly, revisiting the height map, and working to integrate these processes that we've developed into a more cohesive beta release strategy. That being said, at the beginning of this rework, we identified some challenges that we needed to address. These challenges also posed opportunities for us. But ultimately, if we couldn't address these challenges, we were going to have a hard time moving forward with the map at all. So these challenges include adhering to canon descriptions, the idea being that the world of Ice and Fire is a very large place. Some regions in this world are described in great detail in canon writing, some in sparse detail, and some are described not at all. We want to make sure that we're adhering to those details as best as possible, and we want to make sure that we are creating a world that fits the canon that we are given. Another challenge is making canon descriptions come alive. Simply adhering to canon isn't sufficient if what we do is we create a world that doesn't feel real. A Song of Ice and Fire is not particularly high fantasy. It's grittier. It feels real, and the map should reflect that. Our map should feel like a place that exists in a real world, even if there are dragons flying over it. Another important challenge is the size of our map. Our map is absolutely huge. To give you a sense, the pixel count for our map is over 9,000 by 6,000. That may not mean much, so a few other data points to give that might provide some context. We have over 6,100 baronies in Westeros alone. That represents 87%, roughly, of the barony count in the vanilla base game. This scale means that with the future inclusion of Essos, Sothorius, and beyond, we will be dealing with an incredibly large map and immense detail. To put Westeros into real terms, our map is roughly the size of South America. The result is that there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of map to cover, and there's a lot of realism that's needed to make a map that size come to life. Lastly, I'll mention the challenge of scale. Scale is an issue that every strategy game at some point will have to come to terms with, and we are no exception. We are trying to balance the fact that assets in the game will need to be visible, castles will need to be seen from great heights, with the fact that we're dealing with a large map. And if we were true and honest to scale, you probably wouldn't see much of what we need in our players to see in game. In light of the inherent map design challenges that we face, we have come up with a series of design principles that help us not only compensate for those challenges and overcome them, but we think that ultimately they've added quite a bit to that design process and ultimately to the product that we produce. In other words, our map looks better, our map feels more real, and at the end of the day, it's a more enjoyable place to spend your time in CK3 AGOT. The first of these design principles is really our decision-making workflow. And by that I mean, how do we go from a series of in-canon descriptions, or sometimes even just names of regions, and take it all the way to a painted, living, playable world. And that workflow process, we have two different core principles within this kind of overall workflow. Canon descriptions and the natural sciences. Canon descriptions are king. Ultimately, if a World of Ice and Fire, if Game of Thrones, if any of the source material describe a place to be something, we will do our absolute best to make the world that we design reflect that. If something isn't in canon, the question is, does it conflict with what is in canon? In other words, can we support what we're trying to do using canon, or at least do we have any examples that contradict this idea? However, oftentimes, because this is a fantasy world and it's written by people who know not as much about the natural sciences as, say, biologists, scientists, hydrologists, ecologists, and so on, oftentimes we are forced to try to reconcile these differences using our understanding of the natural sciences in the natural world. The Hornwood in the north is exactly that. It is described as the Hornwood and pretty much nothing else we see in canon. That being said, we do know that the Hornwood is the home of House Hornwood, whose sigil is a moose. Given what we understand about where moose live and the hydrology and ecology of those areas, we developed an area that reflects that. We can see beaver dams and bogs and other type of terrain that moose would live in, but around that idea, we were able to grow an entire region that we think looks very realistic and moreover feels like a place where a house might encounter and therefore name themselves, or at least identify their sigil after moose. Another example of our early workflow in action is the Westerlands, and particularly the Highlands region of the Westerlands. This is a region that has some canon description, but largely what we're pulling from is less ecology, although that is a factor, but ultimately from reference art. We identified Highlands areas throughout the world that we thought best exemplified what the Westerlands would look like, and we used that real-world reference art, the real-world Highlands topography to inform our design process. So here in the Westerlands, primarily we're pulling from Scottish Highlands. This, of course, results in a world that, while it's still fantasy, it's not high fantasy. It feels like a real place where one could imagine living in, walking through, being in, and hopefully ruling. Of course, this is just the beginning of the workflow. The next few steps is where things really start to get interesting and where I think we're doing something quite different. But what happens when canon description doesn't make sense in the real world? Right, canon is, of course, the most important thing. But if canon description isn't following any sort of realistic, logical pattern, we have to try to make sense of it. And so for that, an example of that, we can take a look at the Valley of Thenn. Thenn is a warmer, vegetated area, valley, surrounded by icy peaks in the far, far north of the wall. And this seemingly doesn't make a lot of sense. Why is it warmer when everything else is colder? And so what we did is we took a look and we said, well, what are things in the real world that might result in an area like this? And we looked at Yellowstone National Park and the Yellowstone Valley in the United States. And in Yellowstone, geothermal activity results in areas of Yellowstone being warmer, even in the depths of very cold winters. And when we looked at the map provided by canon books and map books and so on for Thenn, what we found is that Thenn pretty much looks like a gigantic caldera, a giant volcanic hotspot. So what we did in designing Then is we added geysers, we added rents in the earth with steam coming out, we added waterfalls coming down from glaciers. Basically, we created a mod canon version of Then that uses geothermals, that uses volcanic activity to help explain through natural means what we see as canon depictions in the book. The last and probably the most interesting part of our workflow as we develop and design and create terrain is how we implement that terrain and allow that terrain and our map to influence in-game mechanics. Because ultimately, the map isn't just something you witness, it's something you experience, it's something you play through, it's something that you have a connection with in-game. And so one of the best ways we can visualize this is using the in-game terrain mechanics themselves. So here we are in the Ice River Clans region, beyond the wall. And we can see if we go to our terrain types, that our terrain types actually reflect the way our map has been painted. So much so, in fact, that we are implementing new terrain types to reflect new types of terrain that we see depicted in Westeros and that are indicative of not just canon, but also our understanding of the natural world and making Westeros and that canon world come to life. So for example, here we have a new terrain type, and you'll have to forgive the unfinished localization here. We are still a work in progress. But here we have the frozen flat terrain type. This is a terrain type that we've given to all areas of the map in which you have a large frozen area that is relatively flat on the map. Compare that to our glacier terrain type. That's where you're going to see frozen areas that are glacial flow. The end result being that we now have terrain that not only reflects canon and science and our understanding of the way Westeros should look, but we can have mechanics tied to those understandings. We can have troops that do well in glaciers. We can have ice river clans that do well on frozen flats. We can have specialty buildings that can only be located in certain types of terrain. So from the beginning, we have an idea of what the world should look like through canon. We visualize that through the lens of science and our understanding of the natural world to make it feel real. We can then take those ideas, apply them to the map, and then use that map to inform the game that you play and the world that you enjoy, and ultimately better understand a mechanical, living, breathing Westeros. Another core design principle that we keep in mind whenever we're designing our map is that every playable holding should feel as real as possible. It should feel lived in, it should be fun to play. We know that the large holdings, the Lord's Paramount keeps, the major landmarks of Westeros are what oftentimes people want to see when they first boot up our game. But we also know that most of our players, in the end, spend their time playing counts and dukes. This means that the star attractions become less important than the localized holdings that you control. It's important, therefore, that even the most minor holding feel interesting and feel like a place that's worth holding on to. Our third design principle is a pretty straightforward one. The idea that biome and terrain continuity can lead to regional continuity, which in turn can make places feel visually connected and real. One of the main ways we do this is with hydrology, with water flow. We are very, very aware of uphill, downhill, the way water will flow, and what regions would be wetter or drier. The last design principle that I'll mention here is really about embracing the size of our map. Having a map of this scale does pose challenges, but it also gives us some distinct advantages. We can make a Westeros that is much more detailed and at a scale that many people who are familiar with 4X strategy games may not be used to seeing. You could easily imagine your armies getting lost in the dunes of Dorne. You can imagine the hunting parties in the large sweeping lands of the Wolfswood. We don't have to represent forests using only a few trees. We can provide scale and context and immersion because our map is so big. And while we definitely feel the challenges sometimes of trying to fill all of that space with interesting and dynamic terrain, the result, we think, is definitely worth it. And here we are. We are back north of the wall. I hope you've enjoyed this tour of Westeros and this trailer for CK3 AGOT. We have so enjoyed working on this map. We still have work to do, but we are excited to bring Westeros to you. And for those of you that didn't quite get enough terrain and map videos during this teaser, I'll leave you with a few more. I hope this holds you over until our beta. So sit back, enjoy the videos, enjoy the music, and we'll see you in Westeros.